What dinosaur would Godzilla be if he was real? And is he even a dinosaur? I'm Reisuka, the cosplaying paleontologist, here to answer that question. If you haven't already, check out part 1 of this video where I do a deep dive and a little crash course for you in taxonomy. And yeah, it'll get you ready and thinking like a paleontologist so you can understand the rest of this video. So check that out if you haven't. And before we go any further, make sure that you like and subscribe to get the latest dinosaur science and news and more from your unhinged dino mommy. After analyzing Dr. Yamane's hypothesis about Godzilla, I feel like, yeah, he had some incorrect assumptions because of the time that the movie took place, 1954, but he also had some assumptions that weren't even correct for that time period. So what would a 21st century paleontologist like me think of Godzilla? That's what you're about to find out. So first off, I would start to assess him and look for diagnostic features. Diagnostic features are a set of characteristics or traits that we can assign to a specific group of animals. What I can say with pretty high confidence is that yes, Godzilla is a vertebrate. He has a spinal column, he has a spine, and this is shown in the end of the movie where we can see that Godzilla has a spinal column and internal bones. But what kind of vertebrate is he? Going from the most ancient to the most recent, he is not a cartilaginous fish because he has really sturdy bones that are made up of calcium, not cartilage. Technically, he would be a bony fish because bony fish share a common ancestor with all vertebrates that are not cartilaginous fish, but no one would say that humans and dinosaurs are fish outside of a biologist or a cosplaying paleontologist making an inside joke that all of us are fish because taxonomy. I got you, Morty. So moving on from the land of bony fish, he cannot be an amphibian. Amphibians have permeable skin, soft-shelled eggs that hatch on water, and a larval phase that's totally aquatic. From other movies from the Showa era, we can see that Godzilla laid hard-shell eggs on land, and Manila is just a smaller Godzilla that can live on land. Now, here's where it gets tricky to give a precise classification. The hard-shelled eggs put Godzilla in the amniote clade, which again, modern reptiles, mammals, and birds belong to, but finding out which amniote he is not as simple as it seems. You might think that we can probably rule out Godzilla being a mammal because he doesn't have internal gestation and he doesn't have hair, but let me tell you about the monotremes. These mammals like platypuses and the echidna, they lay hard-shelled eggs. Yes, I said echidna, like out of ReZero. So internal gestation or giving live birth is not a requirement to be a mammal, guys. Also, the split between reptiles and birds and mammals happened way before those modern day groups ever existed. So the lineage that would give rise to modern mammals is synapsids. This includes some primitive mammals like Dimetrodon, and these animals in this lineage, you know, at the early stages, they laid eggs and they really didn't have hair like modern mammals did. So what we're really trying to figure out now is whether Godzilla was a synapsid or a sauropsid, which is basically the lineage that gave rise to dinosaurs and then living birds. And these groups are very diverse within them, so it's really good to look at a range of characteristics for, you know, diagnosing whether Godzilla should be a part of one of these groups, rather than looking at one single characteristic and putting all of our eggs in one basket. Don't get married to one idea, as one of my former advisors used to say. The easiest thing to do is look at the anatomy of the skull, because all synapsids have a hole behind their eye sockets. We call this the temporal fenestra. In the end of Godzilla 54, we can really briefly see his skeleton as the oxygen destroyer is eating his body. But strangely, their skull does not have a single hole other than their eyes, nostrils, and ears. So you're kind of not falling into either group here, synapsids or sauropsids. Where are you? Where are you, Mr. White? Wake up, Mr. White.
Wake up.
The only amniotes that are anapsids, or the animals that have no holes other than their eyes, nostrils, and ears, are amphibians and turtles. We already ruled out amphibians, and Godzilla doesn't really share any other characteristics with anapsids. So yes, we could assume that this is convergent evolution with turtle skulls, meaning that they came from a different common ancestor but happen to have the same traits by chance, or it's just an artist's attempt to make up a skull and they don't really know that much about anatomy or evolutionary biology, which how can you really blame them? I mean, it's okay. It's okay, man. So whatever, let's go look for other, diagnostic characteristics of synapsids to see if Godzilla could be one, okay? That's not stopping us. Godzilla has external ears and canines, both of which are characteristics that are, usually grouped with mammals. The external ears give the strongest case for Godzilla actually being a synapsid because this is really something that only mammals have. But it is completely absent in the earliest synapsids. And Godzilla lacks the other sort of main traits you need to be a mammal, like skin with a bunch of glands that secretes a bunch of fluids, or, producing milk or having hair. Now, the canine teeth, even though this is something that's generally more diagnostic for synapsids, yes, it can be present in sauropsids. Different shaped teeth that have a variety of function was a novelty of synapsids, and you can see that in Dimetrodon. Their name literally means two-sized teeth. So they have different types of teeth that do different things, just like us humans do. This is why they call them a two-teeth. Because I got canines and molars. You know what that means? I can chew up prey, I can chew up meat, and I can chew up plants. Now that being said, real life nature is always weirder than we can categorize. It's always on the horizon. It's always enigmatic, always just out of our reach. For example, there is a strange dinosaur called Heterodontosaurus, which literally means reptile with different teeth, which has at least 3 different types of teeth. All of the other characteristics of this animal are dinosaur-like, so this is kind of like a strange form of convergent evolution with synapsids. So even though it's unlikely, it's not like impossible for Godzilla to be a sauropsid with 2 different kinds of teeth that do 2 different kinds of things. And it's not impossible for him to have canines. Okay, so looks like the case for synapsids is not very strong. Let's go ahead and make the assumption that Godzilla is a sauropsid, okay? I'm going to be skipping a bunch of sauropsid clades so we can cut straight to the point, because Godzilla has one really rare adaptation that will link him to one group, and guess what that is? If you watch the first video, you'll know. That's right. I'll wait. Go watch it and come back if you didn't. This is your last chance. That's right, Godzilla has legs under his body. He's bipedal, he's walking upright on 2 legs. If you paid attention to that last video, you would know that this is one of the main diagnostic features of dinosaurs. Now, since our information about the skeleton of Godzilla is kind of unreliable at best, we can't confirm that they have the acetabulum or the hole in the hip socket, or whether they have, the hole between the eyes and the nostrils, like I showed you in the last video. So our best guess is that Godzilla is a dinosaur, but it's not super reliable based on the 54 Godzilla. Now, if we continue looking for clues as to what kind of dinosaur Godzilla is, assuming he is a dinosaur, he has some theropod features since he stands on 2 legs, he's bipedal, and he has the teeth of a carnivore. But this is where I will diverge from my previous Godzilla classifications I made on TikTok. Surprise! Surprise!
Surprise, motherfucker.
Earlier on TikTok, I assumed Godzilla was an abelisaurid theropod because of his 4-fingered hand, his huge osteoderms that were on display on his head and back, and his short snout. But there's something I missed previously that might throw this classification off of its feet. Godzilla's footprints shows a 4-fingered foot that walks in a plantigrade stance. If you've watched my video about dinosaur fibulae and feet evolution, you should know by now that all theropods and most dinosaurs basically walked like they were running in heels. In scientific terms, we call this digitigrade. This means that dinosaurs support their body weight on the bones of their toes, while the ankle bones don't touch the ground. Even in the official skeleton, Godzilla's ankles do touch the ground though. This is like what we do as humans, and this is called plantigrade. While I have many complaints about Godzilla's skeleton anatomy, this is a choice that was reflected in actual suit and concept art, and so it looks very intentional to me. My best evidence that this was probably intentional is that a lot of old reconstructions of T-Rex show it with digitigrade feet. So this is kind of like an outdated view of dinosaurs, but it does seem like they were consulting what paleontological sources they had available to them at the time. Now, let's say I made a really big stretch and I went back to my original hypothesis that the four-fingered hand meant that Godzilla was an abelisaurid theropod. And let's say that it didn't lose its fourth finger and it didn't have really reduced fingers and arms like all of the other abelisaurid theropods that we found so far. That still doesn't really explain like the four-toed feet situation. In evolution, losing fingers or toes or fusing them together is actually not a rare thing. In fact, theropods themselves all lost two toes, but they had different numbers of fingers. For example, abelosaurids had 4 fingers, most theropods had 3 fingers, and T-Rex had 2. Now, that being said, a vertebrate gaining fingers and toes, that's something rare. It's so rare, in fact, that I don't really have a real life case example to give you, except that sometimes like marine reptiles have been shown to have duplicated possibly their fingers to create stronger flippers, and that sometimes panda wrist bones can become modified to act as sort of a 6th finger. But none of these really like hold up when you look at them as an evolutionary trait, and none of them are really functional fingers and toes on their own. Unlike on their hands, the ancestors of theropods only had 3 big toes that were facing forward. So if you were going to have 4 toes that were facing forward, that's going to be something that's super rare in evolution. And it would probably mean that you gained a new toe instead of keeping an ancient trait. Or you would have had to have a backward facing, like tiny 4th toe that some theropods had, that would have to somehow twist all the way around and then become huge and in line with the other toes and functional on its own. So either way, super rare evolutionarily. Crazy. So I guess the haters were right. I guess it's dumb to classify it a fake fictional animal like it's real, okay, haters? Because there's really no classification that could get all of the OG Godzilla's traits in one bucket and put them nice and neatly into a monophyletic, valid taxonomic group on the tree of life. Hell, even the creators said they wanted to mix a bunch of dinosaurs and living creatures and Japanese dragons together to make Godzilla. So maybe there was no hope from the beginning. Just kidding. That's what I would say if I was a whiny little You're watching a paleontologist with a PhD here, you little bitches. My job is to classify things that are a tiny sliver of a bone. You think Godzilla's gonna faze me? No. I've seen things far worse than Godzilla. I wish my worst classifications were a complete and living animal that was currently destroying Tokyo. Not really. I want Tokyo to be safe, but you know what I'm saying. What if those characteristics that I thought were diagnostic for dinosaurs are actually only there because they are convergent traits that actually originate from another group, from a different common ancestor? That's right, we're flipping the script again. So let's take a step back from dinosaurs and take a look at archosaurs. There are 2 other groups closely related to dinosaurs that are archosaurs. Remember from the first video, pterosaurs and crocodilians. We can rule out pterosaurs because, Godzilla doesn't have any wings, but Godzilla does seem to be kind of close to crocodilians. Both of them have a semi-aquatic lifestyle and the presence of osteoderms, which are bony structures in their skin that are covered with a scaly-like material. And most importantly, they're both plantigrades and they have 4 toes facing forward on their hind legs. But this still isn't really fully fitting because living crocodilians can't walk on 2 legs. They need all 4 legs to move around, and their legs are splayed out to the side. They're not under their body like they are in Godzilla. But notice that I said living crocodilians. The ones that you know are members of the crocodilomorphs, and even extinct members of this group pretty much resemble the alligators and crocodiles that you know and love. However, if you look at the more basal, extinct crocodilomorphs like Hesperorhynchus, you can notice that these animals do have legs that are situated under their body, even though it's like a quadrupedal stance. This is starting to get closer to what Godzilla's look like. So let's look at the ancestors of Crocodilomorpha. These first appeared around the Triassic, where they were diverging from the basal archosaurs, and the Ornithorida, which is the clade that contains dinosaurs and pterosaurs. And this gave rise to the clade called Pseudosuchian. These false crocodiles were the crocodilians and their ancestors, but some of them decided to take a whole different path path than their modern cousins, and somehow they ended up similar to dinosaurs in a lot of ways way before dinosaurs even existed. For the purposes of identifying Godzilla, some of these similarities were uniquely fitting for the king of the monsters. For example, Arizonosaurus had a Spinosaurus-like sail in the Triassic, while Spinosaurus wouldn't appear until the Cretaceous. Again, these are from different groups, so this is convergent evolution, right? We have two things that look like sails. They're from a different, most recent common ancestor, but they look the same. Maybe they perform the same function. That's convergent evolution, baby! Now, do you know any other reptile that might have really large neural spines? Of course you do, it's Godzilla. Now, another rare trait that Godzilla and the Pseudosuchians have is basically a pair of osteoderms that stick out that go along his back on either side of the main row of plates along his back. And guess which group has a pair of thick osteoderm layers that runs along their back? The Pseudosuchians. Either the more basal Rheosuchus or the more derived Postosuchus had this pair of osteoderms. And as a bonus, Postosuchus had thick osteoderms and taller than average neural spines. While all members of the clade do have pillar erect legs, meaning that there is sort of a part on top of the hip that lets them suspend their legs under their body, so it's not really the same as like being fully bipedal like a dinosaur. This group did have a lot of variety in terms of how many limbs they walked on and what their posture was. But if we're looking for a group of Pseudosuchians that looked like theropod dinosaurs, especially in terms of their posture, we should take a look at the Ornithosuchian family. If your Latin is sharp after learning so many dinosaur names from your dino mommy, you should notice that this name literally translates to bird crocodiles. And if you've watched me for a while, you should know that birds are, that's right, what are they? Tell me what they are. That's right, living dinosaurs, baby.
Remember who you are!
This family is named after Ornithosuchus, a Pseudosuchian that had a skull that was so incredibly similar to theropods that early paleontologists literally thought this thing was the ancestor of theropod dinosaurs. I told you before, judging a book by its cover can be misleading. One of the clues that they weren't dinosaurs was precisely what we're looking at in Godzilla, their feet. They had 5 toes and 5 fingers, and the ones that were the equivalent of your pinky were so reduced that they didn't even have a claw. Now, evolutionary speaking, it's much easier to turn something like this into something with 4 fingers and 4 toes than it is to have Godzilla come from being an albielosaurid. Now, what would Ornithosuchian posture be like? When I first released my TikTok video on the Godzilla classification, we really didn't have an idea of whether they would be like quadrupedal, bipedal, what stance these guys would have taken. But luckily, an article about the Rheosuchus biomechanics was released in June 2024, and it showed that this animal at least had a bipedal, pillar erect posture and that it was plantigrade. Sounds like someone I know, right? Who are we talking about again? Now, the similarities to Godzilla's stance and movement does not stop there, because it had a parasagittal gait. In simpler terms, it basically would move its legs in a line without much rotation, kind of similar to how we walk as humans. Once again, the similarities here are much closer than they are between Godzilla and dinosaurs, because a theropod would have to rotate their knees while they walked, and they wouldn't have their ankles touching the ground. And furthering Godzilla's connection to the Ornithosuchians, their skulls had a really strange curve at the tip. When you combine this with their lower jaw having a protrusion at the end, their upper and lower teeth start to look longer than they actually are. And this gives them the artificial appearance of them being, that's right, canines! It's all coming together now. It's all coming together now, guys. This is science. This is science, Morty.
Yes, science!
Now, the only 2 things that this classification does not cover for Godzilla are his ears and the tail dragging marks that are alongside the footprints. Both of these adaptations could be specific to Godzilla as a species. We call these apomorphic adaptations. In other words, there's something that hasn't been passed on to other species. They are only seen in like the current living species, and we don't know how they're going to evolve. So when we look at these apomorphies, the external ear that we're seeing in Godzilla might just be cartilage that's outside of his ear that's making it look like he has an external ear. And for the tail, Godzilla might have experienced selective evolutionary pressure to elongate its tail so that it could, adapt to having a more aquatic lifestyle. This would explain dragging your tail while you're walking upright. That's not really an efficient way to walk, but maybe it doesn't matter if that dragging tail is much more efficient in the water and you're evolving to have a more aquatic lifestyle. Now that we know all this, how should I explain to the Japanese officials what Godzilla is if I was in Yamane's place as the paleontologist, the go-to? A long time ago, before dinosaurs became giants, it was the Triassic period. During this time, there were creatures that ruled as Earth's largest predators, the Pseudosuchians. As dinosaurs would start to get bigger in the Jurassic period, and these previous rulers would pretty much go extinct. At least that's what we thought before witnessing Odo's Island monster. Somehow, this creature avoided the extinction of their kin by adapting to a completely new niche. It became a land animal that can dive into the deepest regions of the sea. The dual lifestyle of this animal allowed it to reach massive sizes that are only matched by whales, and it did this by going back and forth between habitats to attain food. Despite its massive size, this animal could also coexist with all other life forms, including humans, because it usually had enough food to live on. Odo Island residents has seen it before and called it Gojira, both in admiration for its whale-like size and for its gorilla-like strength. Despite their concerns, Godzilla would at most steal fishing boat cargo and never really threaten humans directly. But today, that all changes. And Godzilla went to Odo Island and caused havoc and destruction that has never been seen before. So why did Godzilla change its relationship with humans? The answer lies in their footprints. All of the water and soil that Godzilla stepped on became radioactive, but it also had a living trilobite and a sample of red clay in its footprint. This clay was contaminated with a bunch of strontium-90, a product of hydrogen bombs. Combined with the other evidence, this suggests that Godzilla's underwater habitat was a rich environment that was isolated enough for animals that we thought were long extinct to continue to survive, until it was hit by an American hydrogen bomb test. Godzilla may have survived because it was one of the only species that could kind of swim out of the detonation zone, and maybe it wasn't really close to the explosion when it detonated, but maybe the other members of its species and all of the other animals that were living around it didn't have the same luck. Since we're hypothesizing that Godzilla has to move between the land and the deep sea to get all of its food and nutrients, destroying one of his main habitats and therefore food sources forced Godzilla to claim new territory. Godzilla refused to become extinct, and they refused to accept it, even if we are the ones standing in its way. And I really can't blame him for that. I mean, I would do the same thing. You gotta fight for survival. Wow, that one was dense, but I hope you had fun anyway, and I hope you learned a bit more about how hard a paleontologist's job is to classify extinct animals while learning a lot more about Godzilla. If you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on more videos about Godzilla and the other kaijus. And by the way, would you comment and tell me which version of Godzilla or which other kaiju you want to hear about? Bye! Love, your unhinged dino mommy.